What if the deepest spiritual breakthrough you've been desperately seeking has been hidden in plain sight, locked away in a practice so profound that one of Christianity's most revered teachers only revealed it to his most trusted inner circle? In 1948, behind the walls of a quiet Shanghai sanctuary, Watchman Nee gathered 7 of his most devoted disciples and whispered a truth so transformative that it would forever alter their understanding of spiritual warfare, divine communion, and the very essence of what it means to walk in the Spirit. This wasn't merely another teaching about abstaining from food. This was the unveiling of a 3-dimensional fasting technique that operates simultaneously on the physical, soulical, and spiritual planes, a methodology so revolutionary that it challenges everything you thought you knew about drawing near to God. Brother Nee, as he was known to his followers, understood that most believers remain trapped in what he called the tyranny of the soul, where their emotions, intellect, and willpower create an impenetrable barrier between their spirit and the throne of the Almighty. Through painstaking years of persecution in prison, through seasons of profound isolation, where only heaven's whispers sustained him, Nee discovered that conventional fasting merely scratches the surface of what God intended when he called his people to humble themselves through abstinence. The technique he shared that evening transcended physical hunger and entered into what he described as the sacred fast of the inner man, where one learns to fast not only from bread, but from the soul's desperate need for emotional experiences, intellectual understanding, and self-directed spiritual efforts. Picture this: while other Christians exhaust themselves trying to feel God's presence through manufactured worship experiences, or strain their minds attempting to comprehend divine mysteries through human reasoning, those who master Nee's hidden technique discover what he called spirit-to-spirit communion, a realm where the noise of the soul falls silent and the deepest chambers of the heart become a dwelling place for the Most High. The testimonies of those 7 disciples, carefully documented but never publicly shared until now, reveal transformations so profound that their very countenance changed, their prayers gained supernatural power, and their ability to discern God's voice became so acute that they could navigate the most complex spiritual battles with heavenly precision. Why is it that the most transformative spiritual practices in Christian history have remained hidden from the eyes of millions of sincere believers? On a suffocating summer afternoon in the year 1948, while Shanghai seethed with political tensions and the church faced growing persecutions, something extraordinary happened in the corridors of an apparently ordinary prayer house. Watchman Nee, already recognized as one of the most penetrating spiritual minds of the 20th century, had discovered something that deeply disturbed him. Most Christians, even those with decades of spiritual journey, remained trapped in what he described as the silent tyranny of the soul. During years of meticulous observation and painful personal experience, Nee had arrived at a revolutionary conclusion that challenged everything traditional Christianity taught about fasting. He perceived that thousands of believers dedicated themselves to conventional fasting, faithfully abstaining from food, but remained spiritually stagnant, emotionally turbulent, and incapable of experiencing that intimate communion with the divine that the Scriptures promised. It was as if there was an invisible barrier, a thick veil that prevented their prayers from piercing the heavens and their souls from finding the true rest that Christ offered. The revelation that would emerge from those days of intense seeking would not only transform the lives of his closest disciples, but establish a completely new paradigm for understanding the 3-dimensional nature of the human being and how God operates through each layer of our existence. What Nee was about to share transcended any religious methodology known until then. He had discovered that fasting, as God originally conceived it, was not a mere ascetic discipline, but rather a master key that opened the three dimensions of human experience simultaneously and progressively. The fasting of the body was only the first step of a spiritual ladder that rose to the deepest regions of the soul, and finally, to the secret chambers of the human spirit, where the manifest presence of the Almighty dwells. In those moments of silent revelation, Nee understood that he had stumbled upon one of the best-kept secrets in spiritual history, a technique that not only broke the tyrannical dominion of physical desires, but also dissolved the emotional and intellectual fortresses that kept the human soul in perpetual captivity. Imagine for a moment that you discovered that everything you learned about your own spiritual nature was incomplete, that there are entire dimensions of your being that have remained dormant simply because no one taught you how to access them. This was precisely the revelation that transformed Nee's understanding of the human condition when he dove into the depths of Scripture and discovered that man is not a two-dimensional entity composed only of body and soul, but rather a magnificently complex being created with three distinct spheres of existence. The body, which connects us to the material world, the soul, which houses our personality, emotions and intellect, and the spirit, that sacred dimension that was designed to be the permanent residence of the Holy Spirit. Nee observed with growing clarity that the tragedy of modern Christianity resided precisely in this fundamental confusion about our threefold nature. Most believers lived as if they were only body and soul, completely oblivious to the reality that they possessed a spirit that, when properly released and nourished, could revolutionize their entire experience with God. He perceived that when people fasted conventionally, they were only scratching the surface of an unfathomable spiritual ocean, like someone trying to quench thirst by drinking seawater. The more they drink, the thirstier they become. The problem was not in the sincerity of their searches, but in the limited understanding of how God had structured the human being to function. The revelation that would change everything came when Nee understood that each of these three dimensions, body, soul, and spirit, possessed its own specific form of fasting, and that only when the three types of fasting operated in harmony were the conditions created for genuine and lasting spiritual transformation. The fasting of the body broke the dominion of physical appetites and material needs. The fasting of the soul dissolved the tyranny of unbridled emotions, obsessive thoughts, and obstinate self-will. But the fasting of the spirit, this was the secret of secrets, involved such complete surrender of the ego that one's very natural identity was crucified so that Christ could live through the person literally and visibly. It was a process of such depth that it transformed not only the individual's inner experience, but radiated a tangible presence that others could perceive without fully understanding what they were experiencing. Why do so many sincere Christians remain trapped in endless cycles of spiritual struggle, alternating between moments of religious fervor and periods of devastating emotional dryness, without ever experiencing that stability and deep peace that Christ promised to his followers? Nee had identified the core of this spiritual epidemic that plagued the church of his time and continues to devastate millions today. The unbroken soul keeps the spirit in an invisible prison, preventing God's life from flowing freely through the person. He observed that the human soul, with its insatiable thirst for emotional experiences, its compulsive need to intellectually understand divine mysteries, and its iron determination to maintain control over circumstances, functions as a thick barrier between the regenerated spirit and the reality of God. This revolutionary discovery was born from his own personal struggles and the painful observations he made during years of intensive ministry. Nee realized that many believers, including himself in his early years of Christian walk, lived as prisoners of their own soul, being constantly dragged by waves of emotion, tormented by intellectual doubts, or exhausted by the efforts of self-will to please God. It was as if there were two people fighting within the same body, the regenerated spirit that longed for pure communion with God, and the unregenerated soul that insisted on filtering every spiritual experience through its own distorted lenses. The result was a Christian life characterized by instability, frustration, and a persistent feeling that something crucial was missing. The three-dimensional fasting technique that Nee developed was designed specifically to break this tyranny of the soul and release the spirit to assume its divinely ordained leadership position. He discovered that when a person learned to fast, not only from food, but also from their emotional needs, from their dependence on rational understanding, and finally from their own identity and personal agenda, something extraordinary began to happen. The soul gradually lost its tyrannical control over the inner life. The spirit emerged from obscurity to assume leadership, and the person began to experience that quality of life that Jesus described when he said his followers would have rivers of living water flowing from within them. It was no longer a matter of striving to feel God's presence or struggling to understand his ways. Instead, the person found themselves living in an atmosphere of continuous communion, where the Holy Spirit could flow through them without obstacles. There is something deeply mysterious about how God transforms ordinary human beings into spiritual giants. Watchman Nee's story during his 20 years of imprisonment offers a rare window for understanding this divine process. When the communist authorities arrested him in 1952, they imagined they were simply eliminating another problematic religious leader, but they were actually providing Nee with the perfect laboratory where he could test and refine his understanding of three-dimensional fasting under conditions of extreme pressure. Confined in a tiny cell, deprived of physical freedom, separated from his loved ones, and subjected to regular public humiliations, Nee discovered that he had been placed in a situation where only the deepest spiritual principles could sustain him. It was in this hostile and degrading environment that the three-dimensional fasting technique revealed its true transformative potency. Nee could no longer fast conventionally from food. His prison rations barely sustained life. But he discovered that he could plunge into even deeper layers of spiritual fasting that he had only glimpsed in freedom. He learned to fast from his expectations about how God should deliver him, from his emotional need to be understood and vindicated by others, from his intellectual desire to understand why he was suffering, and finally from his own agenda about how his life should unfold. This process of progressive stripping was not passive resignation to injustice, but rather active participation in the type of suffering that Christ himself experienced. A voluntary emptying that created interior space for divine life to manifest with supernatural power. The testimonies of his fellow prisoners reveal that something extraordinary had happened to Nee during those terrible years. Even in the most degrading conditions, he radiated a peace that could not be explained by external circumstances, a joy that transcended his physical situation, and a spiritual authority that transformed atmospheres even in an environment designed to break the human spirit. Other prisoners, including those who had been deliberately placed in his cell to torment him, found themselves inexplicably drawn to conversations with him, discovering in him a source of hope and wisdom that defied all logic. When Nee finally departed this earthly life in May of 1972, his last words to a friend were a declaration that encapsulated his entire spiritual journey. "I have never given up my faith. I have never given up my confidence. I have faith in Jesus Christ." These were not the words of someone who had simply endured suffering, but of someone who had discovered how to transform even the most devastating experiences into fuel for spiritual growth, through the application of the deepest principles of multidimensional fasting. What really happens when a human being completely masters the art of three-dimensional fasting that Watchman Nee discovered during his darkest and most glorious years? The carefully documented testimonies of the 7 disciples who received this teaching firsthand offer a glimpse of transformations so profound that they challenge our conventional understanding of the limits of human experience with the divine. Each of these men and women reported that, after months of diligent practice of the technique revealed by Nee, they began to experience a quality of spiritual life that transcended anything they had known previously. No longer the emotional highs and lows that characterize the typical Christian experience, but a deep stability rooted in what Nee called spirit-to-spirit communion. These transformations were not merely interior. They manifested in visible changes that others could perceive immediately. People who had known these disciples for years reported that their very countenances had changed. There was a serenity in their eyes, a quality of presence that made others feel instantly at peace, and a spiritual authority that manifested not through words or dramatic gestures, but through a powerful quietness that seemed charged with the very presence of God. Their prayers gained a quality that surprised even mature spiritual leaders. They were no longer desperate pleas or emotional petitions, but tranquil communion with someone they clearly knew intimately and personally. When they faced crises or opposition, they no longer reacted with anxiety or human strategies, but seemed to access a source of wisdom and strength that flowed from a place beyond their own natural capacities. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these transformations was how these disciples began to navigate what Nee described as the hidden life with Christ in God. An existence where personal agenda had been so completely crucified that Christ literally lived through them in ways that were simultaneously supernatural and completely natural. They did not become less human. On the contrary, they became more truly human than most people ever experience, because they were finally functioning the way God originally designed humanity to function. Their lives became living demonstrations that it is possible for ordinary human beings to experience the type of union with God that transcends the typical limitations of religious experience, where prayer becomes as natural as breathing, where peace remains intact, regardless of external circumstances, and where divine wisdom flows through daily decisions with a clarity that surprises even those who experience it. This was not theological theory or mystical aspiration. It was transformed life lived in real time, demonstrating that the deepest spiritual secrets are not reserved for a chosen few, but are available to anyone willing to pay the price of total dispossession that three-dimensional fasting demands. As the echoes of Nee's final testimony fade into the corridors of history, we stand at the threshold of a profound question that cannot be escaped. What if the very suffering you are experiencing right now, the spiritual dryness that torments your nights, the sense of distance from God that haunts your prayers, is not evidence of divine abandonment, but rather the invitation to discover the deepest chambers of your own spirit? The testimonies of those 7 disciples were not fairy tales written to inspire religious sentiment. They were documented transformations that occurred when ordinary human beings learned to fast, not just from bread, but from their soul's desperate need to understand, to feel, and to control the mysteries of God. When Nee breathed his last breath in that cold prison cell, he carried with him the unshakable certainty that he had tasted something beyond the reach of earthly circumstances, a communion so deep that 20 years of imprisonment could not diminish its reality. The technique he revealed operates on a principle that challenges everything our modern minds want to believe about spiritual growth: that the pathway to divine intimacy leads not through accumulation of religious experiences, but through the systematic dismantling of everything the soul uses to maintain its tyrannical control over the inner life. Every moment you spend frustrated with your prayer life, every season of spiritual dryness you endure, every instance when God seems distant and unresponsive, may actually be an invitation to discover what lies beyond the realm of solical experience. The three-dimensional fasting that Nee practiced in those final decades was not about punishing the body or even disciplining the mind. It was about creating the interior conditions where the human spirit could emerge from its prison and assume its rightful place as the dwelling of the Most High. Perhaps the most unsettling truth embedded in Nee's legacy is this: most of what we call spiritual growth never moves beyond the soul realm, never transcends the endless cycle of emotional highs and intellectual insights that keep us perpetually dependent on external stimulation to feel connected to God. The disciples who received his teaching discovered that when the soul's dominion is finally broken through the practice of multidimensional fasting, something extraordinary happens. Prayer transforms from desperate petition to tranquil communion. Circumstances lose their power to determine inner peace, and the presence of God becomes as natural and constant as breathing. They learn to live in what Nee called the secret place of the Most High, where the storms of life rage outside, but cannot penetrate the sanctuary of the Spirit where Christ dwells in uninterrupted fellowship. The question that haunts every sincere seeker echoes through these testimonies with uncomfortable clarity. Are you willing to pay the price of complete soul death to discover what lies beyond the veil of your own emotional and intellectual experience with God? This is not a theoretical question posed by distant theologians, but the practical challenge that every person faces who has glimpsed the possibility of experiencing God as he truly is rather than as our souls imagine him to be. The seven who learned Nee's technique discovered that the journey into spirit-to-spirit communion requires a death so complete, a surrender so absolute, that most believers recoil from its demands and settle for the emotional satisfaction of solical Christianity. But for those rare souls who press beyond the familiar territory of religious feeling and intellectual understanding, there awaits an encounter with the living God that transforms not just their inner experience, but radiates through their very presence in ways that touch everyone around them. In the end, Watchman Nee's greatest gift to the Church was not a new technique or methodology, but the demonstration that it is possible for human beings to live in such intimate communion with God that even the darkest circumstances cannot dim the light of his presence within them. His 20 years of imprisonment became not a tragedy to be endured, but a laboratory where the deepest principles of spiritual transformation could be tested under the most extreme conditions. As you close your eyes tonight and consider your own spiritual journey, the question that will not leave you in peace is this: what if everything you think you know about encountering God is just the beginning, and the real adventure of faith lies in regions of the Spirit you have never dared to explore? If this message has stirred something deep within your spirit, if you recognize the hunger for a dimension of spiritual experience that transcends the ordinary, then you understand why this teaching cannot remain hidden in the shadows of history. Share this revelation with others who are desperate for authentic transformation. Like this video if you sense that God is calling you to press beyond the familiar boundaries of religious experience. Subscribe to join a community of seekers who refuse to settle for spiritual mediocrity. And comment below with your own journey into the deeper places of God, because your testimony might be the very encouragement someone needs to take their first step beyond the soul's prison into the glorious liberty of the Spirit.